Hello, my name is Patrick Bolinger. I am a graduating senior here at Texas Tech. I am a university studies major, as you probably guessed already. My areas of focus are horticulture, which is the study of plants in essence, uh, psychology, study of the human brain, how it interacts with its environment, and organizational leadership, which I would describe as essentially understanding how to operate and lead within a business or an organization. Pretty self-explanatory there. But getting into what I have to talk about today is plant intelligence. And this is a topic that is somewhat debated and isn't really well understood. And that's something that I would like to really dig into and kind of help you understand. And its importance on why it's important to know this, because it could have huge impacts for the way we practice medicine and the way that we approach new problems completely unrelated to this. And I try to encapsulate all this in my thesis because I think all of it is really important to the fundamental understanding of our natural world and how its interconnectedness and how we fit into that. Um, in the abstract, I stated how the goal of this paper was to understand the mechanisms associated with intelligence and to draw parallels between the common factors. Um, there, my argument for making this an interdisciplinary problem is simple. Neurobiology tries to tackle this, but I think it is symptomatic of something greater within Western science specifically. Something that you can find in the Eastern world, in the Eastern industrialized countries with high tech science, but it's something here that we really struggle with, and that's dialectical thinking. It's hard for us in the West to see things as equal and true simultaneously. For us, it's either yes or no, black or white, left or right. And we see this all throughout our culture. It's incredibly prevalent and obvious for those who are willing to look. But what is important about that in relation to this topic of plant intelligence is that we assume we know because we don't understand. And it was once put to me like this, that in the West, many people look at science as a vast continent that is just totally explored. We know every nook and cranny, what type of trees grow, where the trees grow, the rocks, the minerals, the cities, the people, the game, all of that. But the reality is we don't. Our history emerged less than 11,000 years ago after the end of the Ice Age. We know very little about ourselves, let alone the rest of the planet. And so when we are investigating a problem like, are plants capable of intelligence, it's easy for us to assume, especially in the Western world, to just blow it off. Oh, that's just kookery, it's woo-woo. None of that. But that's not the case. There is strong evidence suggesting that plants can achieve some sort of state of intelligence or are capable of interacting with their environment in a way that would suggest some level of intelligence. Not individually, and I'll go into this later, but plants in groups, and specifically when they start forming symbiotic relationships with fungi and other plants through their root systems. But going forward, plant intelligence is something that's not new. This is actually a pretty old concept. It goes back to Darwin. A book Darwin and his son wrote was The Power of Movement in Plants. And a lot of it was just mechanism and the anatomical functions and features of plants. But it was theorized that the roots were some sort of brain for the plant, like they were like the equivalent of like a bundle of nerves. And in many ways, they are. They act like that. They act like the neurons in our own brain, the dendrites, and some of their behavior. Like when I snap my finger, what's going on before I snap my finger is there are sodium channels on the neurons in my brain, and if they go positive, the action potential, it builds and it builds and it builds until the signal sends, and I snap my finger. Well, plants have this very similar type system in their roots, and it uses auxin instead of sodium channels. But essentially, if auxin starts dying off on one side, if there's a negative auxin level on one side, the plant will start growing away from that. And so it's kind of like a very similar system where if you have a pot, it's kind of the opposite, but it's the same concept, it's the same trick, and that's something nature likes to do. If nature finds a successful strategy, they repeat it over and over again until it has to adapt and evolve. And my argument is while these systems might look different, And especially since, well, you already said yourself that they happen in contradictory ways. Well, we're looking at a much more archaic version of that. It's the difference between the old brick cell phones we have today that were just a few transistors and circuit boards compared to the iPhones and iWatches and Galaxy phones that we have today that are much better than many computers out there. Average iPhone has more technology on it than the Apollo 11 did. Everyone's heard that, and that's something that we kind of take for granted. And then when we look back through history, and by history I mean our evolutionary history, we're talking hundreds of millions, billions of years ago that these plants started to develop these chemicals and these technological features that have allowed them to survive and thrive on our planet, and that eventually led to our own development and evolution, directly and indirectly. So it's important to note that everything is really connected on this planet, that all life here, the source is singular. We don't know what that source is, but from the evidence that we have now, it's best and it's probably most accurate to suggest that it is. Going forward, the areas that I investigated was plant behavior, which I called the culmination of physiological activity, sensory aptitude, and communication capabilities. And I think what's really important, one of the most interesting at least, was the communication capabilities, because most of us don't think plants don't really communicate. Well, actually, that's wrong. Plants communicate to other plants by releasing pollen, which can signal some plants to start producing ova, and will start the sexual propagation process. Others, there are exopheromones that we humans, we pick up on with our nose, and that can cue us into certain things. It can heighten our smell. It can heighten our sight. It can make us sleepy and tired in significant amounts. And there's other communication systems like ethylene gas. When a bunch of bananas, that you have on your counter, they always go bad real quick. Well, that's because the ethylene gas in those bags builds up. Or if you just leave them, if you break them apart, the ethylene gas escapes. But when some ethylene gas touches a banana where that one's not producing ethylene gas, that's a signal. That's a chemical signal to that banana to start producing ethylene gas, to start ripening more quickly. And so plants communicate just within themselves in very intricate and amazing ways. Now, something that is absolutely extraordinary and that not much is known about yet, a fair amount, but not enough to say anything conclusive, but mycorrhizal networks, which is a fungi, can connect and communicate with many tree roots and other plant roots. They all connect, and it acts like as a sort of an electrochemical network, which is very similar to how our own brain works. And so it's kind of like a brain on a much larger scale that's not as powerful, but it is still capable of computing information. And it's more analog than digital, which our brain is considered a hybridization of those type of features. But there really isn't enough evidence to rule out any sort of digital format, which is, to put in layman's terms, it's the difference between internal, like wetware, software, and external stimuli causing mechanistic reactions. But I would say that there's probably some sort of combination of both going on that we just don't understand it fully, because, by any scientist that's studying this topic, admittedly, they would probably say something very similar. But with these mycorrhizal networks and root networks, they're able to transfer through electrochemical reactions. Let's say a plant's being attacked by an aphid or a disease or some other pest. Plants on another side of the forest, they're connected to this mycorrhizal network, which can span miles and connect to many different trees. They can share resources by funneling them through the mycorrhizal network, and the network will essentially deposit those resources that the plant under attack needs to fight off the, let's say, just foreign invaders. It can transfer that to them, and it'll help them fight off, because the trees somehow understand that if one of them goes down, the likelihood for another increases, because essentially if a tree starts to die, that virus is going to grow exponentially within that matter. And that matter is going to spread eventually one way or another to the other trees. So it's almost like they are trying to preserve themselves against these enemies, and they can do it in groups. They're not just individuals. That they can form societies in a way to fight off their enemies, which is something that is absolutely remarkable and something that, to my mind, represents signs of intelligence of some sort. I don't think it can be argued that one day that they'll evolve to do math, but that we might be able to understand our own intelligence somehow and how to carry it forward into the future, especially with all this research into artificial intelligence. I think this is something that should be seriously considered. Now, pardon me. Moving forward, one of the papers that I cited in this, and I found that was like very interesting, was "Do Plants Have Brains?" written by DeSala and Tattersall. And the idea that plants have nervous systems stems from several ideas. Firstly, plants have genes similar to those that specify components in animal nervous systems. So hereditary-wise, in the grand scheme of things, the genes that give us the ability to build neurons, plants have those, but they aren't fully developed yet. They're there. The base is there. It's like having the foundation and the walls, but you don't have the roof, you don't have the couch. But that was a few billion years ago. So they wouldn't have the roof or the couch yet, and speaking metaphorically. Now, they also have components for receptors of glutamate, which is an amino acid, and it's one of the building blocks of many neurotransmitters. It's actually one of the most important neurotransmitters. There are other components such as G-box proteins, which is a family of 4,3,3 proteins that act to bind various signaling proteins in our brain, and they act in very similar manners within plants. And so you're starting to see a pattern here, a trend. Now, the proteins in plants behave differently than they do in humans, but the functions are fundamentally the same. It's like the difference between a bike and a motorcycle. They're using some similar manners to generate energy. There's a chain on both of them that's moving the wheels, but one has an engine and one doesn't, and one has oil filling it up, and the other, it's just our legs, which we use, carbohydrates and food to fuel, but the principle pretty much stands the same. And thirdly, one of the most fascinating points of this is some plants show a synapse-like region between cells, which they have something like neurotransmitter molecules that facilitate cell-to-cell communication within the plant, just like we do within our own body, just like we do in our own brain. And so we're seeing these parallels start to lay out before us. Nature is using the same tricks over and over again, because if she can make it work once, she'll make it work twice until it doesn't work. That's just kind of how nature operates. Now, one of the arguments against this of glutamate being neural in plants is that it also acts like a defense protein. And I would take this right back to the argument I was just making, that this is a more primitive version of this technology, and it's not going to act the exact same way. So if you're looking for perfection, you came to the wrong place, because at this level, I mean, even if I wouldn't say this technology is perfect now in ourselves with our own bodies and minds, but back then it was even more rudimentary. It hadn't had the stimuli to shape it into what it is today, and that I believe that we are taking advantage of. Another important topic on this is auxin. Auxin's in all plants. It's very important. It is considered by the authors to demonstrate a persuasive neurological argument for plants. Transporters of auxin behave like many neurological receptors do. They assist the movement of auxin across the cell membrane via cellular vesicles. However, auxin is not found in animals. It is found in plants, and it appears in a protein that regulates growth. The auxin transport system is accomplished through vesicle trafficking and is influenced by light and gravity to control cell-to-cell communication. Auxin still has many characteristics that would lend it to be more similar to a neurotransmitter type behavior, but this is something that seems to be that was weeded out in the process of inventing what we have today. Pardon me. And something else I found that was interesting is plants don't just use photosynthesis for metabolism, and this was something I found in Do Plants Think? Similar title as the one before I know, but like minds, I suppose. There are unique group of genes in plants that facilitate the plant's ability to determine if it is light or dark, which for some plants would cause the leaves to unfold at night, unfold during the day, so they can start to metabolize the energy that they're sucking up through the ground and go with the photosynthetic process. This group of genes also happens to be in human biology, and it interacts with human biology in a very important way, and it's the timing of cell division and the axonal growth of neurons and the proper functioning of the immune system. I mean, these are the argument I'm laying out here is that the vascular system and the nervous system and all these things are related and interact intimately with the plant world because they are essentially a gift from the plant epoch of evolution of billions of years ago to the animal epoch of evolution that we happen to find ourselves in today. Or rather, we're probably entering the technological epoch, but, we don't need to split hairs. They also regulate light responses in animals too, in our eyes. So the reason our eyes expand, the iris expands and contracts, that's that group of genes in plants that's partially responsible for photosynthesis. So it's, like I was saying earlier, the same tricks are being used over and over again. Now, the root brain hypothesis, which I spoke about at the beginning, was a hypothesis of Charles and Francis, Charles Darwin's son. And this was by Mancuso and Barlow and Volkmann. And Mancuso actually happened to give a TED Talk on this topic. And it's being revived after 125 years that maybe that they were really onto something with this and that we just we didn't understand it at the time. Sometimes genius can be a little bit intimidating and we can misinterpret it. This happens again and again. Every genius, they say, is a little bit crazy, and so some of their ideas are probably wrong. And that's very fair to say because it's most often than not true. But in this case, it seems like we put one more into the crazy box than it needed to be put there. And from the quote that Darwin made about this would be, or in his son, I suppose, it is hardly an exaggeration to say that the tip of the radial, thus endowed with sensitivity and having the power of directing the movements of adjoining parts, acts like the brain of one of the lower animals, the brain being seated within the anterior end of the body, receiving impressions from the sense organs and directing the several movements. Now, that's a really interesting thought that he had. And he had no way of knowing how our own brain worked. But he recognized the similarity, just maybe intuitively, or maybe long hours of thought. I don't really know. But the fact is that he noticed this, and this is the father of really the revolutionary of biological science. I mean, modern medicine just wouldn't be what it is today if it wasn't for this one man. And so he really made this important discovery that just now we're beginning to go into. Now, the center of the inquest in the root brain hypothesis centers around the behavioral patterns of apical meristematic tissue, found at the root tips, and the sections of the root probe around the soil in search of nutrients, and are even aware of the density of other objects in the media. So if they go up against a rock, they're not going to keep trying to go through that rock because they can somehow sense it through the pressure that they're receiving through the meristematic tissue that kind of reacts like a chain reaction all the way up the root. And that's kind of where our understanding of it ends in a way, but it begins there too. Now, the foundation of this behavioral tactic is a part of a series of actions that involve the aforementioned auxin transport system from do plants have brains. Yet ethylene also has a primary responsibility for controlling the bending of roots, which are the transition and elongation zones of the roots. And as I discussed with the bananas, as they mature and start to ripen, that's a maturation process. The same process is kind of going on in the roots, where at the apical tip, it's very sensitive and it can detect things. But as you go and as that root grows, more and more of that root becomes the elongation and maturation zone that produces ethylene gas. Now, from this data, it can be determined that roots are able to translate data from sensory experiences. And I use the experiences with the quotes because we don't know if they actually are experiencing, but there's really no better way to put it with understanding it aptly. Now, I think the part I need to get into here with science is that science can be incredibly dogmatic, and sometimes we don't see the forest for the trees, and that is our greatest enemy. And that's something that time and time again we've had to overcome is our own presumptions. And with something this important that could really give us insight into our own minds, I think it's important that we put presumptions aside, especially when you consider the chemicals plants produce. Most of the medicines that pharmaceutical companies make are based off in some way plants. Roots, leaves, fruit. I mean, opium created morphine, created heroin, created all sorts of things. Um, there are many cannabinol drugs that they produce based off cannabis. Cannabis itself, the oil can be used to treat cancer, a variety of brain cancers and other cancers. We're looking at things that directly interact with our nervous and vascular system. And what's interesting, I think I used this in the paper, the example of psilocybin from psilocybin mushrooms, which is a serogenic stimulant. The body metabolizes that drug and many others, just to point out, but specifically this one, as if it was endogenous. So by that I mean it treats it as if it wasn't something that we ingested from the outside. It treats it as if it was something that it produced. And in fact, it produces many chemicals that are just like it, like serotonin. Serotonin and psilocybin are very similar. And psilocybin has a tryptamine core, and we produce many tryptamines through our pituitary and pineal glands. And so it's a very interesting problem we have here is why is it plants are producing all these chemicals that we make? And the answer, I think, is that we borrowed this technology somewhere down the line from plants, or plants influenced our brain with this. And that's what's given us this amazing ability to articulate like I am now to you and how you do to me with these technology, these inventions. That before we started to interact with all these plants, with all these chemicals, we could have been quite dumb. And then the very basis of what makes us be able to move, control our meat bodies with these bones is these chemicals interacting with the tissue through neurons and the nervous system. And that's something that is incredibly intriguing, but there's going to have to be a lot of research done before we really understand what's going on here. In closing, I'd like to say that this proposition that plants are intelligent and have reasoning capabilities is a bit big, and it's hard to swallow. But the more and more we know, and especially with genomics, which is the most important thing, because as I talked about earlier, how many of the genes that make some of our own mechanistic and anatomical processes operate, like our eyes, our brains, our olfactory glands, our taste buds, a lot of these chemicals have genetic roots in the plant world. And so the problem will become tracing these back and finding out to where they connect and trying to figure out where in history do these things fit in together. And I'd like to close it there. Thank you for your time. Thank you for watching this. I really appreciate it, allowing me to investigate this and kind of, hopefully I educated you some on this, and maybe you can come back at something with me. Criticism, I would love criticism. I think criticism is something that makes any argument stronger, and maybe if I'm wasting my time, you can convince me of that, and I would love that. That would make me very happy. But with that, Patrick Bolinger signing off. Thank you.